All right, man, peace. So anyone who has followed the NBA for long enough knows that the NBA is just like life. It's cyclical. During one era, the Eastern Conference will have the stronger teams. In another era, the Western Conference will have the stronger teams. For example, in the 80s, the Eastern Conference had the more dominant teams. You had the Philadelphia 76ers, the Boston Celtics, the Detroit Pistons, and right underneath them, you had the Milwaukee Bucks. In the Western Conference, you had the LA Lakers. They were the dominant franchise in the Western Conference during the 80s. Every once in a while, the Houston Rockets would make an appearance in the finals, but people pretty much knew that the Lakers were going to represent the West in the finals. Now, in the 90s, of course, you had the preeminence of the Chicago Bulls in the East. And even though you had certain teams like the New York Knicks or the Indiana Pacers, the Western Conference was viewed as being the deeper conference, because oftentimes they would have 6, maybe even 7 teams that won 50 games in the regular season. The East would have the Bulls. They would win somewhere in the mid-60s. And then you would have maybe 2 or 3 other teams that won in the 50s. The league was a little bit more balanced in the 90s. But overall, you knew that the Western Conference was the deeper conference. And that pretty much lasted until the LA Lakers decided to trade Shaquille O'Neal to the Miami Heat. Thereafter, the Eastern Conference kind of balanced out the overall power in the NBA between West and East. It was pretty much equal. And now the West is by far the more dominant conference, to the point where the NBA is considering possibly either realigning the teams or changing the playoff format. So, of course, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
What you already heard was the sense that the league may start looking again at the playoff seeding, 1 through 16, that the West becomes stronger. The Lakers now become relevant again, and Paul George going west, Jimmy Butler going west, and now LeBron.
Well, Jimmy Butler didn't really go west because Minnesota is not fully in the West. They're in the Western Conference, but they're not fully in the West. Beyond that, he was traded there. He didn't go there as a free agent. As a matter of fact, I think that Jimmy Butler is likely to come back to the Eastern Conference when he gets the opportunity, because allegedly he wants to partner up with one of his best friends, Kyrie Irving. And I could certainly see them being very close friends. They have very similar, quirky personalities. A couple of black dudes who like to cruise the streets for white chicks and talk about all types of esoteric philosophies and things of that nature. But definitely the Western Conference has the balance of power tilted in its direction. Do I believe that the NBA should consider some type of realignment or some form of reconfiguration of the playoff format? I really think that they should. But I think that it's going to be very difficult for them to convince the owners to do so, because it may affect their overall revenue, especially in the Eastern Conference right now, where they may stand to lose playoff appearances, playoff games, home games in the playoffs if they consent to Adam Silver saying that we should realign the teams or we should change the playoff format so that we can pretty much make our league conference proof in regards to who has the more affluent players. We don't want to be in the position where all of our prominent players want to come to the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference basically becomes the junior varsity. We don't want that.
LeBron from Cleveland to LA, there was a sense that maybe the conferences would start to balance at some point, and great talent keeps going in that direction.
I've been waiting for this topic all show, guys. So that was our Adrian Wojnarowski saying the league may look at the idea of reseeding the playoffs. And Max, other than Boston, possibly Philadelphia, all of the best teams are in the West, literally. So should the NBA consider this?
Let me say this before Max Kellerman speaks. If they're going to realign or reconfigure the playoff format, they should just go all the way with it. Get rid of the conferences, get rid of the divisions, and just make it the top 16 teams. They've already changed the All-Star playoff format, where pretty much the teams are chosen based off of the captains, regardless of the conference that they play in. So they might as well trickle it down to the NBA regular season format, so that each team is playing all the other teams an equal amount of times, or as equal as possible, so that you don't have any teams claiming, well, we would have made the playoffs, but the NBA decided that they're going to choose the top 16 records, even though we had to play tougher competition throughout the regular season. Just go all the way with it. You've already changed the playoff format. Get rid of the conferences. Get rid of the divisions. Nobody cares who wins these divisions anyway. And just make it the top 16 teams out of your 30 or 32 teams, however many NBA teams there are. Top 16 teams make the playoffs. The rest of the teams go into the lottery, and we go just by record. And they talk about flight mileage, and all these teams are flying private, so who really cares about flight mileage at this point in time? It's not like they're flying commercial.
No, for that exact reason. It's a terrible idea. The most densely populated areas are on the East Coast, but there are also a lot of, especially in the Northeast, where the most densely populated areas are, there are also the bad weather cities. And the NBA plays a lot of its season through the bad weather. Who wants to live like that?
Well, Max Kellerman, I have very bad news for you, sir. A lot of those densely populated East Coast cities are also some of your biggest television markets in the country. So you do have to appease them in some way. You can't just tell them we're going to let you draft top-level players, and then after 4 or 5 years, they're going to go play with LA or they're going to go play with the Rockets, and you just have to sit down and be quiet. No, sir, you can't do that. You are going to have to appease them in some way, especially since some of your biggest basketball cities are in the Eastern Conference, that being the Philadelphia market, the Boston market, the New York market, the DC market, the Chicago market, etc. So we can't just say, well, we all know that these basketball players, they want to play in LA because it's 75 degrees every day and all the women out there are allegedly so beautiful, so on and so forth. That's not how business works, sir.
That's the reason so many guys choose to go west. It's nicer weather, nicer living conditions, and sometimes no state tax. By the way, I mean, like, that's true of Florida and Miami, but mainly you're talking about out west. And even when you do pay state tax in California, you figure, okay, the way we're living, it's worth it out there, right? So no, it's a bad idea because you'd be excluding enormous and densely populated regions, huge amounts of the NBA fan base. Stephen A., I wouldn't be opposed to saying 8 teams get in from the East, 8 teams get in from the West, and once you have the playoff teams, reseeding according to record.
That's where I'm going.
So at least
That's where I'm going.
Yeah.
Well, here's the issue with that, Max Kellerman. If you decide that you're going to have 8 teams from the West and 8 teams from the East, then it's possible, highly probable, that you're not going to have the best teams in the playoffs. In last year's playoffs, the Denver Nuggets did not make the playoffs. And I'm sure that they were one of the top 16 teams in the NBA. If you just make it 1 through 16, then you will assure that you're going to have the best 16 teams, but you have to make sure that the regular season schedule is equaled out. That's what we have to make sure if we're going to do any form of realignment or reconfiguration of the NBA playoff format. We have to change the regular season schedule as well. That may be an issue for certain owners, but I also think that if you're someone in the Eastern Conference, if you're a Charlotte Hornets owner like a Michael Jordan, and there's a possibility that you may get a LeBron James into your city twice a year instead of once a year, that can appease you, especially if you know that you're not going to make the playoffs. There are certain ways that we can make sure that you, quote unquote, grease the palms of many of these owners who already know that their teams are not going to make the playoffs once they're assured that some of the top-notch franchises are going to be making appearances in their buildings more than they would have before, especially when you know that you're not going to be competing for anything of substance. But I think that it's time for the NBA to change up their format a little bit so that they don't have to worry about many of these conversations. And if you're not serious about it, then stop bringing it up. Stop talking about how all the talent's out west or all the talent's out east, but you don't want to change anything. If you don't want to change anything, stop talking about it.
Okay, in no way am I implying that the 1 to 16 seeding should just be the top 16 teams, because you understand that the conference that you're dwelling in, you recognize that you have to compete with the teams within your conference. You understand what the rules are prior to the start of the season. You got to go out there and handle your business and be one of those top 8 teams within.
Just get rid of the conferences once again. It seems like they're already on their way towards doing that with the way in which they changed up their NBA All-Star Game protocol.
Within your conference. But I think once the top 8 teams are selected from each conference, I would be open to proposing a 1 to 16 seeding, and those 16 teams go against each other based on the seedings. Because when you look at the balance of power that exists within the Western Conference, it's incredibly alarming. Right now, the only relevant team that I see in the championship picture is the Boston Celtics. I don't see anybody, and I'll give Toronto.
Stephen A. Smith, brother, once again, what you and Max Kellerman are not considering is that when you have more talent in the West than you do in the East, you're going to have teams in the Western Conference that are going to have lesser records than teams in the Eastern Conference. But when you reseed for the playoffs, they're not going to have home court because those teams in the Eastern Conference had easier schedules because they play each other more. So you can't just wait until you get to the playoffs and reshuffle the seeding. You have to reshuffle the regular season schedule so that we know who the actual 16 best teams are once we get to the playoffs. Then we don't have to reseed anybody. And no one really can complain because we've already played a relatively balanced schedule and we know who's who. If we do it how you guys are postulating, we're going to get to the playoffs and you're going to have Western Conference teams like a Utah Jazz, say they win 49 games, and they could have been, say, a 5th seed in the Western Conference. But now, once you reshuffle, you might have 4 or 5 teams in the East that win over 50 games because they're playing a weaker schedule, or the bottom part of the Eastern Conference is weaker, and now the Utah Jazz could drop all the way down to a 10th seed or an 11th seed. And I'm sure that they're not going to like that, especially if they have to play multiple rounds with no home court. That's going to take away some of the playoff revenue from their owner because they're playing less home games.
Outside chance now that LeBron has left the conference, because we recognize that they were a good team. They won 59 games last year. They haven't had any changes. DeRozan and Lowry and all of these boys are still there. Their problem was the fact that LeBron James was their kryptonite. They saw him, and it was like Freddy Krueger, for crying out loud. He was like Freddy Krueger to them. You know, they were petrified of him. But with him out west now, you don't have to worry about him. So in light of that.
Yeah, but brother, let's be for real. The Eastern Conference playoffs are going to be whack juice. It's basically going to be, let's hope that the Boston Celtics can stay healthy throughout the regular season. Let's hope that they can get to the NBA Finals. Because if anybody else other than them gets to the finals, it's not going to look good.
That the only teams that I see worth even talking about in the Eastern Conference is Boston and Toronto, and with Philly on the outside looking in because of it.
Well, Philadelphia, they do have a certain amount of allure as a team because of Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons. They have some star power. But I don't think that they're going to have enough to overcome the Celtics next year. They lost in 5 games to a team with no Kyrie Irving or Gordon Hayward. What are they going to do next year? They have not added any notable free agents.
Embiid and Ben Simmons. If Ben Simmons gets a jump shot, it's a different conversation. But if
Stephen A. Smith, come on, bro. Let's be for real. We're talking about if Ben Simmons gets a jump shot. When you say that about a player, it's because that's someone who could make a wide open jump shot. But if they're contested, you pretty much know they're going to miss. This dude, Ben Simmons, cannot even make a shot outside of 8 feet from the basket. It's atrocious. It's pathetic.
But if he's the same Ben Simmons, they'll go home in the second round in 5 games again. That's it. So I would want to do something about that, and I would have a 1-16 seeding, but I agree with you. It would be after the 8 teams from each conference is selected, as opposed to just going with the 16 teams with the top record, because that would eliminate about 4 or 5 teams in the East, and most of the playoff teams would be out west, and I don't think that's good.
Then get rid of the conferences. Problem solved. Simple as that. No more Eastern Conference, Western Conference. With private planes now, there's really no need to differentiate or create that type of partition, because you can get from Oakland all the way to Boston on a private plane in 2 or 3 hours? It's not like the 80s where the players had to fly commercial, and it was important to make sure that the schedule was heavily weighed. Back in the 80s, the Bulls would play the Pistons 6 times a year. They play Boston, the Knicks, 6 times a year because of travel. You don't have those issues anymore. Just get rid of the conferences, get rid of the divisions, and just let it be all 32 teams going up against one another. Whoever the top 16 teams are, they make the playoffs. That's it. Because if they do it how these guys are saying, there are going to be some Western Conference teams who are not going to get home court in the first 2 rounds, and they're going to feel like we had to play a tougher regular season than these Eastern Conference guys, and we're getting penalized in the playoffs.
You know, you mentioned some of these teams in the East, right? I think Boston's going to be really interesting. And Boston has this incredible basketball history, and it's an incredible sports town, and it's densely populated, and they have money to spend. And it took the greatest GM in the game in Danny Ainge years to put together this team that still hasn't been to a finals. That's like a perfect case scenario.
It really didn't take him that long, Max Kellerman. What year did they trade Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett? Was it 2014? He traded them after 2014. It's only been 4 years. And they were a very good team in the 2016-2017 season with Isaiah Thomas. They were competitive in 2015-2016. And in 2017, 2018, they were the best team in the Eastern Conference. It really did not take him as long to rebuild as people make it out to be.
And they still haven't been to a finals. Philly has a great upside, but we have to wait and see. Other than that, in the East, I don't find Toronto very interesting, to tell you the truth. And the fact that they're north of the border, you got to deal with customs and international travel and all that stuff.
Oh, you know what? I think it was 2013 that Danny Ainge traded Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, because I believe it was the 2014 playoffs where the Heat played them in the first round. And LeBron had that game where he scored his then playoff high 49 points against the Brooklyn Nets in Brooklyn. So I believe that it was 2013 when Danny Ainge made that huge deal to trade Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. Either way, it wasn't more than 2 seasons where the Boston Celtics were absolutely moribund as a franchise.
I think that dissuades guys, not to mention taxes and stuff. If you look at what else, New York's been incompetently run, Chicago hasn't been incredibly run, and they've had bad luck. Those are the 2 major urban centers of the East and Midwest, which is the Eastern Conference. You look at the East, Stephen A., other than Boston and Philly, really, you're talking about interesting teams, Milwaukee and Indiana. And we all know that what are the odds that Milwaukee can actually put together and retain players to make a real dynastic run, even if they could ever get there?
It depends on how well they draft. You may have said the same thing about the Golden State Warriors 7 or 8 years ago. Depends on how well you draft.
It's slim, because the history of sports shows us that when a player has the option to leave Milwaukee or a kind of mid-sized Midwestern town like that, they almost always do. They either get traded out, which they force, or they sign elsewhere.
Depends on how well the franchise is run. Kevin Durant did originally re-sign with the OKC Thunder. Many people forget that. I believe it was after the 2012 season that he originally re-signed with them, 2012 or 2013. The reason why he left OKC wasn't because he was looking for a bigger market or to live a more lavish lifestyle. It was to get away from that nut job, Russell Westbrook.
In any league where player movement is based on the player's own decisions,
spit it out. Come on, goddamn. All him mumbling like damn Porky Pig. Ba-deet, ba-deet, ba-deet.
Common, right? So baseball and basketball, that's what happens. So the idea that it's ever going to be different in a bad weather, not huge market, Midwestern town is ridiculous. It's never going to be like that. It would take a guy like LeBron being born in Akron, right next to Cleveland, and even then you're probably going to lose him eventually. So you must not reseed before the playoffs. About that we agree, or else you're going to take huge swaths of the country and just eliminate their interest in the NBA.
No, you just have to get rid of the conferences, that's all.
Stephen A.
Okay.
Let me ask you this,
Yep.
because, and I'm directing this at you, and then Max, you can jump in. So Max and I have had the pleasure of living in LA. I was at NFL Network for about 3 years. Max, I think you were in LA, 7+ years, right?
Almost 6 years.
Okay, 6 years. LA radio, obviously with Marcellus, Sports Nation, and then of course your HBO boxing stuff. So Stephen A., we know LeBron went to Miami. You enjoyed it. You're comfortable with South Beach. Then he went to Cleveland. You were very, very depressed. How do you feel now, sir, about having to go to LA to cover these games? I'm just wondering, are you going to be okay with it?
I think I'm going to.
Am I okay with it? Molly Carroll, Molly Wood. I'm so excited that LeBron James had the audacity to marry the unmitigated gall to take his talents to LA. Because the hoes are out.
I think I'm going to be okay with it. I think I'll manage to survive. It'll be a struggle. Obviously, it's a few things that's a struggle. I mean, my role with my recurring role with General Hospital.
Oh, I forgot you're a thespian.
Some of my other aspirations that I have. It wouldn't be surprised. Unfortunately, I would tell you that probably within the next 2 years, I'm going to be forced to have to practically live in LA.
Oh, get a second home, Stephen A. Can you afford a second home?
Well, I'm working on that now. So it's very unfortunate that I have to deal with the pressures and the laborious circumstances of having to ultimately live in LA. I'm going to have to figure that.
Stephen A. Smith is another witch, by the way. Omega Psi Phi fraternity member. Venerator of the Dog of Death, Anubis.
That out, Max, and
allegedly.
And and just work it out.
Yeah.
It's just a terrible, terrible scenario for myself. But I'm going to have to figure out how to get over it and just, deal with suffering in LA. I'm just going to have to deal
Max,
with it.
I've never wanted to.
That's basically it on that. They've covered everything that they're going to cover in regards to this LeBron James situation. So we'll see what happens. If the NBA is actually going to reconfigure the conferences, I think that they should. I think that it's time to let go of a lot of those antiquated conventions per se, and just embrace the fact that travel is much easier, and the people will quickly get used to and accustomed to the new convention of there not being any conferences or any divisions. Just making sure that your team is one of the top 16 teams in the NBA. When they hold the draft, they don't say, well, here's going to be the draft for the Eastern Conference teams and here's going to be the draft for the Western Conference team. They just do the entire NBA. So they might as well do it here because it would ensure the best teams, it would ensure the best competition. And by them getting rid of the conferences and also reorganizing the regular season schedule, it would take away a lot of the excuses from some of the owners that may say to themselves, well, wait a minute. If you're going to allow 8 teams from the Eastern Conference and 8 teams from the West and then reshuffle the deck once we get there, that's going to take away possible home games for me. That's going to take away revenue from me. When you do it straight from the regular season, they cannot complain. But anyway, peace.